All right, let's see what all I've managed to do on the 65 AC30. So the worst of the panel damage has been addressed to an acceptable level because the wood will cover this. It's not perfect, but it's hard to undo all that kind of abuse over the years. And a lot of these little things have been straightened out. I've done one round of cleaning on the panel. I've got another to go to get some of this tape residue off, but one thing at a time. I've got most of the dirt off now. I need to clean the knobs too. But I'm pleased with that. And speaking of cleaning, someone spilled a Coke or something in this amp about 1974 or whatever. It was just this huge, ungodly, sticky mess. It was just really yucky. It was greasy, it was gummy. It was all around this area. It was deep in the tube sockets. And I think I've got all that cleaned up. I mean, it's not factory new, but it's certainly amazingly better. There's the new dual 16 filter cap. More on that in a moment. But, you know, it may seem just cosmetic, but all that stuff can accelerate rust. We want to keep this going as long as possible. And having all that yuck down in the tube sockets certainly would not have been a good thing. So let me flip things around and show you some of the inside stuff. Okay, I've got a Timpton jack so I can connect standard speaker cabs to it. Right now I've got it hooked up to the 8 ohm tap for use with my main cab. And when I test it with the blues later, I'll switch to the 16. I left that cap there. No problem with that Mallory right there. I've changed out the 4 25 microfarad electrolytics with the Sprague TE series, which are fantastic. That black 2.2 nanofarad cap that was there in the tremolo circuit had cracked in two, so it's got a Vichy in there. So far, I've not done anything to the preamp other than change out those electrolytics that I knew needed to be changed out. And you have to be very careful working on these tag boards. They're very fragile. If you use a big solder sucker, the recoil of that can just shear things off. So I just go through a lot of desoldering braid because it's gentle. And on that ground connection for the tremolo volume pot, it was just tack soldered to that wire. I undid that and put in a tiny little bit of bus wire connecting the two, so there's mechanical support before it's soldered. Then we've got the new 30 microfarad cap and the new dual 8, and there's some silicone beneath them. This clip's not a perfect fit, but it's being held in place by the silicone and the negative, and has very little tension on it. I think it's going to be just fine, because finding clamps that go in there can be tricky. If necessary, I can do it. This one's snug in there, though it does have silicone as well. All right, so a new grounded power cable. All the chassis grounds in this entire amp were loose, and all the nuts and bolts that hold one section of the chassis to the next were loose, which would have been a grounding nightmare. So more on that in a bit, but essentially there's this part of the chassis and there's this part of the chassis, and they're bolted to each other. And when that hardware gets loose, not only is it mechanically weak, but anything using ground here is not going to, grounded to this part of the chassis, is not necessarily going to have ground continuity to this part of the chassis. So what I've done here is I moved the negative of the dual 8 from here to the same part of the board where this 30 microfarad is. That's the preamp ground, and that's connected to the input jack wiring and a chassis ground connection over there. So that's a good place to be. And then this, after I cleaned and tightened everything, this is only used for the AC safety ground. Hospital grade plug. Let's see if I can show that. Pretty. And this old voltage selector switch is just falling apart. And it had a whole bunch of stuff connected to the 240, and it was all just bird's nest. So the 220 and the 240 are heat shrinked off, and everything here is bundled together. The 117 is going directly, that's the primary, the 117 primary is going directly to this side of the fuse. The hot comes into the switch, the neutral comes into the switch. The other side of the hot goes to this fuse and then to the 117, and the neutral is right here. That's all very clean. That's very nice. Let's go to the rest of it. Let me flip this upside down. This terminal strip was just a nightmare as it came in. It had great big resistors going to this ground here. This ground is transformer mounting bolt holding in place. It was all loose, so that ground wasn't really ground. Everything in the amp was loose. The old phenolic material and the old terminal strip was broken, and nothing was really secure. So I replaced that terminal strip. I've got the heaters going here, and the heaters to the preamp there, and the heaters to the power tubes here. And then that center one, I confirmed that's a good chassis ground. So instead of using this little flimsy bit of metal, I've got the center tap for the HT supply and what I believe to be the shield of this power transformer connected here. But I also ran a wire from this point where the center tap of the HT supply goes to the new filter cap. So this is the main first two stages of filtering in this amp. So rather than grounding it right here, which is where the cathode of the output tubes is grounded, it is now grounded over here, physically distant from everything else, which is a good place to have that first noisy node grounded. Then the cathode here has got a new 220 microfarad 100 volt cap, and we will see if this 47 ohm resistor biases things correctly with modern wall voltages, or whether the owner is going to be using a variac. I need to call him about that. This resistor may get changed to set the bias correct. First thing I'm going to do is measure where the heaters are with 117 volts or 120 volts wall voltage, and then I'll see where the bias is out. Then I'll talk to the owner about whether we need to run this with a variac, or whether the heaters are fine but the bias resistor needs to be changed, etc., etc. I moved, instead of having a huge, useless artificial center tap over here, I moved to here, and two little 100 ohm half watts are referenced from each side of the heater supply to the cathode, which will have 10 to 12 volts on it, DC. So just a little bit of free DC lift right there. It doesn't change the vintage circuit, but it sure gets rid of the vintage noise. Now, someone before me put in these 2 or 3 watt 100 ohm screen grid resistors, and these are the old 1.5K grid stoppers, which actually measure closer to 1.8K. If this were my amp, I would change these out to at least 470 ohms, probably 1Ks, and I would increase these to about 3K for stability. I will talk to the owner. The vintage value is kind of something that Vox only got away with, JMI only got away with, because they were using Mullard and Brimar tubes. This is cruel punishment for current production tubes. And it still would have worn out a lot of the Mullards and Brimars. So I'm going to see if he wants to have the absolute vintage value, or if he wants the amp to sound and perform its best. You know, it sounds like marketing on my end. I don't make any more money putting in a 1K than I do putting in 100 ohm. And if I change these 4 resistors out, it does not affect the labor really. It's just part of the process. So this is not a let me change your stuff so I can make money thing. This is a let me change your stuff so it'll sound and work better thing. But, you know, the vintage market is crazy. And over here on this 30 microfarad node for the tremolo circuit, again, instead of bringing the ground to this ground point on this chassis, I ran a wire up to the preamp stuff, and it's connected to one of the cathodes in the vibrato circuit. So this all the preamp filtering, this 30 microfarad, the other 30 microfarad, and the dual 8 are referenced to the input ground connection on the other chassis, and only the cathode and the HT stuff is really referenced here. It takes the screen node with it as well, just because of the dual section can cap, but that should be more than fine. Gives a nice reduction in noise with very little change. Most people wouldn't notice it cosmetically, but it sure makes for a quieter amp, as does going through and tightening every little bit of hardware throughout the entire thing, which had not been done, since 1965. These added diodes on the rectifier tube socket are fine, and I will leave them in place. It just makes life a little bit easier for a JJ or Sovtech GZ34 going forward. It doesn't really change the sound. You're not going to notice a 1 volt drop in B+, but it does help against any potential surges. It's mostly needed in amps like the Custom Classic series that have standby, which puts a lot of stress on the rectifier tube. This amp doesn't have standby, so these are kind of not doing anything, and I'm content to leave them in place, because if they do anything at all, it's good. And also, if there was to be a dead short in a rectifier tube, it does give a little bit of protection to the secondaries of the power transformer. Now, there's a lot of discoloration here as if there was fire in the past. This seems to be the exact same original power transformer here, and all the sockets seem to be original. I suspect that screen grid resistors went up in smoke in the past. You can see some discoloration on the wire here for the heaters. Here's almost the color they started off as, and here's the color this little stretch is. There's no melting insulation here, so I think this was just smoke around it, and I suspect it was the old screen grid resistors that went south and made a lot of stank. But most of it's cleaned up. I can get that perfect, but that's about 2 extra hours of billing that I don't think I need to volunteer the owner for. There's no rust or anything, and unless there's just a terrible noise when I power it up, which I have not done yet. Everything seems fine. It's possible that these tube sockets need to be replaced because of smoke and heat damage, but as much extensive cleaning as I just gave them, I think we're at a good place to put some tubes in and power it on. Okay, with the amp getting 114 volts from the wall, use that Variac for that. It's an old one, but it still works just fine. 114 volts from the wall puts the heaters right at 6.3 volts. Now, I could probably go up to 120 volts on this amp and the heaters would be fine. And I could drop down a little bit if someone wanted to run it at 110. But 114 is where the heaters with US 60 hertz power comes in right at the nominally desired 6.3 volts. So 114 volts AC is kind of the target. And with the amp getting 114 volts AC, the output is idling at 15 watts, which is too hot. Now, if I lower the wall voltage until the bias sets right, say about 14 watts, then the heaters will be running a little bit cooler. And the reason for all that is JMI goofed when they spec'd out their power transformers, because they forgot that the US ran at 60 hertz mains, and so they did all their math or proportions as if the US had 50 hertz mains. So that bias resistor needs to be increased to make sure that the tubes last a long time. And as you can hopefully hear in the background, with all the channel volumes off, we got a lot of hiss and crackle. So I've got to go on a resistor hunt. That's fun. I'm going to start by troubleshooting just the normal channel, because that's one triode and one phase inverter, and that's it. And once I get that quiet, I will add in the top boost channel, and once that is quiet, I will add in the vibrato channel. You got to divide and conquer, otherwise it'll drive you nuts. So if you'll excuse me, I've got some work to do. Well, these big WEMAs were leaking about 10 volts each. So that's no good. And there's a lot of hiss in the output. When I mute the input to the phase inverter, both inputs, things are still noisy. And these resistors just have had their time. Carbon composite resistors are period correct, and they have a certain sound, but they have some well-known downsides. And after 60 years, I think it's more than reasonable to say it's time for them to be replaced. They'll be replaced with new carbon comps, and the old ones will be returned with the amp in case some idiot collector wants to put them in his amp, because people don't understand what makes amps sound good. All those great records from the 60s were done with brand new amps. All right, got all that stuff in the phase inverter changed out. No more leaks here. And I know that the phase inverter is quiet, though the signal coming into it is not. Let me demonstrate. Here's one of the two 220K mix resistors that mixes the normal and the top boost channels together. If I mute that, the amp goes silent. So that tells me it is either noisy resistors or something right before that. I know in this case that it is not the normal volume pot, because that's at ground right now. It's grounded, it's turned counterclockwise. So when I look at the treble pot wiper, which is on the other 220K resistor, silence. And I know that the grid of the top boost circuit for a second gain stage is grounded out by this volume pot here. So it is within the top boost tube socket and its associated components. I suspect that it is a combination of this plate resistor here and very likely the 56K on the cathode of the follower where that noise is coming from. I know that I have not measured any DC leakage on these Phillips mustard caps, or even on the little ceramic cap for the treble. So it's most likely resistors that we're hearing. It's possibly also a dirty tube socket. I have not changed the preamp tube socket, cleaned the preamp tube sockets yet. But I bet it's either this 100K or the 56K on the cathode, and I will report back. I mentioned it might be the 56K or the 100K. The 56K actually measures 1.3 meg, and the 100K actually measures 155K. So yeah, I'd say those have drifted a little bit. Let me change those out and see where we're at. All right, now that those two resistors have been changed, all that awful staticky white noise is gone, and we're left with fairly standard white noise. I can reduce that further. That's going to be some other resistors in that channel. That's the top boost channel. And then in the normal channel, all is well until that could be a number of things. We will get to that later. For right now, while the amp is quiet, of course it stopped doing it as soon as I press record, there are the occasional sputters and pops audible in the output. And when I grounded this point here, which is one of the inputs to the phase inverter, the noise was still there. I know it's not a tube because the tube is a brand new one. That's good in other amps. It could be dirt in the tube socket. It could be those old 1.5K grid stoppers on the output tubes. But I will need to wait till it starts making that noise again for me to do some more troubleshooting on that. Right now though, the worst of the issues with the top boost channel are dealt with. You know, those are just those two change resistors there. It may be a couple additional cathodes. It will certainly be some additional plates, and it may be that these mixing resistors need to be changed out. They do tend to go noisy over the years. Pretty much as a rule of thumb, and this is just a in a general sense. Resistors 47K and up are very likely to become noisy. Resistors under 47K are much less likely to become sources of noise. It's just because of the way things work, and I don't want to get too far into it, but that doesn't mean that a 1.5K is not going to be noisy, or an 820. It's going to depend on its function in the circuit. But in general, when I'm looking at sources of noise in an amp, I'm first looking at plates and other values over 47K. So I got Steve heading over here to take a look at his deluxe reverb, so I'll put this to the side and I will get back to this, and I look forward to hearing it for the first time after that, because now I know that it's at least playable. Before, the noise level would have been such that it would have just sounded like you're trying to play through an AM radio. Anyway, great progress. Okay, I've got a lot of the noise out. I changed the dropping resistor in the plates for the normal and brilliant channels, and I have set the tremolo depth on the tremolo channel. I have not done anything else to the tremolo channel. Let's hear that. That's working well, but as you can hear, that channel is really noisy, so I've got some things to chase down in it. Most likely plates. The other high value resistors in there, like there are a lot of 1 megs in that channel, are actually to ground, and a very complex filter they have in there. I don't think they're going to be the culprit for that noise, because although it's possible, I also need to check and see if any of these caps are leaky. I hope not. We will find out. But I'm going to come back to this channel. Let's go to the normal channel. And it is much quieter by comparison. You'll notice it's kind of dark. They are. That's with the cut turned off, so there's no high end attenuation. I deliberately made the normal channel in the Excalibur 15, at least for the version that has the pentode rather than top boost, a little bit brighter. Though that's only the lower gain stuff, just to make it a little more usable, because this gets too dark when it's clean. And when it's clean, it's really... So I didn't make the Excalibur 15 bright, just a little bit, a little more clarity. When this amp is 100% healthy, I'm going to do a video comparing this 65 JMI to the Excalibur to a TBX that I have fully modded. Now the normal channel still has hum and buzz. That's most apparent at the high gain. I'm going to track that down. That may just be the mix resistor. Those 220Ks like to get noisy. I don't know how apparent it's going to be through this cell phone audio, especially since the cab is 6 feet directly to the left of the cell phone. But it's not the most pleasant sound when it does overdrive. It's got a grittiness and a sound like there's some oscillation happening. I will track that down. That could just be a couple of bad things or something, some of this old wire. It's a little bit microphonic. And those pops have come back. Let's move on to the top boost brilliant channel, which is what most people buy this amp for. And let me turn the cut up quite a bit so it doesn't take our heads off. Now, this is not the first time I've heard this channel. This is just the first time I put it on video. And it is really lacking in lows, which makes the high end very exaggerated. And it has that same gritty blockiness that the normal channel does. So I need to look into that. I know a lot of things it's not anymore, but it could be a few other things. And I need to measure these caps in the tone stack and see if they're actually really are 22 nanofarad or whether they have drifted, because the low end response is not great. It could also be the pots. I will track that down. This one doesn't have the same kind of buzz at high volumes, but you can hear that hum in the background. I need to get rid of that. So I will. You just see if anyone has made a change to the grounding method of this amp. There's just so many little things that can go wrong over the years, and sometimes in an amp like this where everything's just kind of layered on top of each other, it takes a while to find it. I want to do as little work as possible. I want to leave as many original things as possible. Sometimes in order to see whether an original component can stay, that means disturbing an original solder joint. But the end result will be worth it. So time to dive back in.